"I never believed American support was truly genuine." Those words, spoken by Kurdish activist Heavy Ahmed in an interview with France 24, captured the growing sense of betrayal felt across Syria's Kurdish population after a devastating start to the year. The Kurdish forces, once regarded as Washington's most valuable ally in the fight against ISIS, found themselves in direct conflict with the Syrian army and suffered a decisive defeat. In what Al Jazeera described as the most intense fighting since the fall of Bashar al-Assad in 2024, Syrian government forces engaged the Syrian Democratic Forces, or SDF, the country's leading Kurdish-led military coalition, in Aleppo. Reports said that dozens were killed and more than 150,000 civilians were displaced from Sheikh Maqsoud and Ashrafia, two Kurdish districts that had operated with relative autonomy for nearly a decade. Yet it was not the battle itself that transformed Syria, it was what followed. Building on its momentum, the Syrian military and its allied militias launched a wider campaign across northern Syria, targeting key SDF-controlled territory, including Raqqa, the former capital of the Islamic State's self-declared caliphate. Within days, Kurdish resistance began to collapse. On January 20th, the Syrian government announced a 14-point ceasefire agreement that required the SDF to surrender control of critical infrastructure, including border crossings, oil fields, and gas facilities. Most significantly, the agreement gave Kurdish forces only 4 days to integrate into the Syrian National Army. A force that had been fighting Damascus was now expected to become part of the same military it had resisted for years. So how did this happen? How did the Kurds go from being backed by the United States to experiencing one of the most dramatic battlefield collapses in recent memory? Why did Washington choose not to intervene? And perhaps most importantly, what happens next for Syria? To understand this collapse, it is important to understand the Kurdish position inside Syria. For generations, Kurdish communities lived along Syria's northern border as one of the country's largest ethnic minorities. Yet, under successive Syrian governments, they were systematically marginalized. Damascus refused to formally recognize Kurdish identity, restricted the Kurdish language in public life, and in 1962 stripped more than 120,000 Kurds of citizenship, leaving many effectively stateless. When civil war erupted in 2011, Kurdish forces moved quickly. As Syrian troops withdrew from Kurdish-majority regions to fight elsewhere, Kurdish militias filled the vacuum and gradually established control across large parts of northeastern Syria. The most prominent of these groups was the People's Protection Units, or YPG. Over time, they established a semi-autonomous region known as Rojava, built around local governance, decentralization, and political autonomy. But that autonomy immediately created tensions, especially with Turkey. Ankara viewed the YPG as closely linked to the PKK, a Kurdish militant organization that had fought the Turkish state for decades. To Turkey, a Kurdish-controlled region along its southern border represented a direct national security threat. And then, ISIS changed everything. When ISIS expanded across Syria and Iraq in 2014, Kurdish fighters became one of the most effective forces resisting them on the ground. The United States saw the Kurdish militias as the best option, given that the Arab fighting factions in the region shared the same Sunni ideology as al-Qaeda. The battle for Kobani became a turning point. As Kurdish forces held the city against overwhelming odds, the United States began providing air support, weapons, and military coordination. By 2015, the YPG joined with other militias to form the Syrian Democratic Forces, the SDF. With American backing, the SDF became the most effective anti-ISIS force in Syria. They liberated Raqqa, they secured oil fields, and they became central to Washington's strategy. But the partnership was never permanent. American support was always tactical, and eventually, that distinction would matter. The collapse of the SDF was not caused by a single event. It was the result of three forces converging at once. First, Turkey, Multiple reports suggested Turkish surveillance drones operated over Kurdish areas shortly before Syrian forces launched their offensive. Although Ankara denied direct involvement, Turkey had both the motive and the capability to support an operation that weakened Kurdish control. Second, the United States. Washington had long viewed its alliance with the SDF as temporary. Once ISIS was territorially defeated, American priorities shifted towards stabilizing Syria through Damascus rather than preserving Kurdish autonomy. When Syrian officials reportedly briefed U.S. representatives before the operation, Washington chose not to interfere. But for Kurdish leaders, that silence was unmistakable. Third, and perhaps most damaging, the SDF began losing internal support. Arab tribal fighters who had once fought alongside Kurdish commanders began abandoning their positions. Some defected, others simply stood aside. In several Arab-majority towns, Syrian government forces were welcomed as liberators. Years of political tension inside SDF held territory had created resentment among local Arab communities, who increasingly viewed Kurdish rule as centralized and exclusionary. Without American protection, without regional support, and without internal cohesion, the SDF collapsed with stunning speed. The immediate military battle may be over, but the consequences are only beginning. One of the most urgent concerns involves ISIS detainees. For years, the SDF guarded thousands of ISIS prisoners in camps and detention centers across northeastern Syria. As Kurdish control weakened, security inside several facilities also deteriorated. Reports indicate that multiple detainees escaped during the fighting. That raises a serious question. Can the Syrian government effectively manage one of the most dangerous prisoner populations in the region? For many observers, the answer remains uncertain. For Syria's Kurdish population, the future is even more unclear. The dream of lasting Kurdish autonomy now appears to be fading. In its place is a growing fear that Damascus may demand obedience without offering meaningful protection. And for Syria as a whole, this moment could define the country's future. The way the new government treats Kurdish communities and other minorities will reveal whether Syria is moving toward national reconciliation or simply rebuilding centralized rule under a different leadership. That is why this moment matters far beyond the battlefield. Because what happened in northern Syria was not just the collapse of an alliance. It may prove to be the first real test of what post-war Syria is becoming.